The Westchester Country Club didn't just smell like money. It smelled like the kind of absolute, centuries-old certainty that only comes when you've never had to check your bank balance before buying a car. The air was filtered, chilled to a precise 68 degrees, and carried a faint, cloying scent of lilies and expensive floor wax. I stood in the grand hallway, adjusting my navy silk tie in a gold leaf mirror. This tie had cost me $200 at a boutique in Manhattan. To most of the people in this room, that was pocket change. To me, it was a symbol. I remembered exactly how many hours of scrubbing tile floors it had taken to afford this single piece of silk. I remembered the scent of the industrial bleach that used to stain my skin, a sharp, chemical sting that no amount of expensive cologne could ever truly wash away from my memory. I wasn't here to be a guest of honor. I was here for Caleb, my little brother. I had raised him since our parents were taken from us in a rain-slicked car wreck 15 years ago. I had been his father, his mother, and his protector. Seeing him today, standing at the end of that aisle in a tuxedo that fit him perfectly, was supposed to be my victory lap. It was the moment I could finally say I had fulfilled my promise to our mother. I walked into the ballroom. The floor was a sea of polished white marble that reflected the glow of a dozen crystal chandeliers. I scanned the room for my name. I was directed to table 18, tucked away in a corner near the kitchen doors, far from the elevated dais where the Ashford family sat like royalty. I didn't mind. I preferred the shadows. That's where an auditor does his best work anyway. But as I reached my seat, my eyes fell on the place card. It was thick, cream-colored cardstock with elegant, raised gold lettering. I didn't see my name. Instead, the card read, "Janitor Brother, living off our charity." The words didn't just hurt. They felt like a physical weight pressing against my chest. My vision blurred for a second. I looked around. At the next table, a group of Alara's cousins, young men in tailored suits who had never worked a day in their lives, were leaning toward each other, whispering and pointing. When they saw me look up, they didn't turn away. They laughed. It was a jagged, cruel sound that cut through the soft string quartet music playing in the background. Across the room, Richard Ashford, the patriarch of the family, was watching me. He was a man who built his empire on real estate and intimidation. He sat with his shoulders back, his silver hair perfectly coiffed, holding a glass of vintage champagne. He didn't look away. He gave me a slow, deliberate nod, his lips curling into a thin, predatory smile. He had ordered this. He had paid a calligrapher to write those specific, hateful words. He wanted everyone in this room to know that no matter how much money I earned now as a senior forensic auditor, in his house, I was still just the help. I felt a surge of heat in my throat, a primitive urge to flip the table and scream. But I didn't. I am a man of logic and ledgers. I know that in any conflict, the one who shows their hand first is the one who loses. I took a slow, deep breath, counting to 4, then exhaling for 6. I pulled out my chair and sat down. I picked up the card and turned it over in my fingers. The ink was fresh. Richard thought he was reminding me of my place. He thought he was showing me his power. What he didn't realize was that he was giving me a reason to look into his soul. And as an auditor, when I look for something, I always find the deficit. Caleb should have been in the holding room, preparing for the grand entrance, but he had a habit of checking on me when things felt too quiet. He slipped into the ballroom through a side door, his face bright with the nervous energy of a groom. He saw me sitting alone at table 18 and started toward me, his hand extended for a fist bump. But then his eyes dropped to the table. He saw the card. I watched the light go out of my brother's eyes. I watched his jaw set in that hard, stubborn line I had seen 1,000 times when he was a kid fighting off bullies. He didn't say a word to me. He grabbed the card and marched straight toward the head table. I stood up to stop him, but I was too late. The room went silent as the groom, the man of the hour, slammed a piece of cardstock onto the table in front of Richard Ashford. "What the hell is this, Richard?" Caleb's voice wasn't loud, but in that silent ballroom, it carried like thunder. Richard didn't even flinch. He took a slow sip of his drink, let it linger on his tongue, and then looked up at Caleb with an expression of bored amusement. It's a reality check, son. Your brother has spent the last year acting like he's our equal. I thought it was important for the guests to understand the true pedigree of the family we're inviting into our circle. It was a joke. Don't tell me you've lost your sense of humor along with your common sense. A joke. Caleb leaned over the table, his hands shaking with rage. This man worked 2 jobs to put me through school. He skipped meals so I could have a laptop. He is the most honorable person in this room, and you just spit on him in front of everyone. If this is your idea of family, then I want no part of it. The wedding is over. Alara and I are leaving. The silence that followed was suffocating. I saw Alara Ashford stand up, her white silk gown shimmering under the lights. She looked at the card, then at her father. Her face turned a shade of pale that made her look like a statue. "Dad, tell me you didn't do this," she whispered. Richard's face hardened. The mask of the gracious host vanished, replaced by the cold, calculating steel of a billionaire who was used to owning everything he touched. He looked at Caleb, then at his daughter. "Sit down, Alara. And you, Caleb, listen to me very carefully. You have a job offer waiting for you at Harrington and Vale. I own 30% of that firm's parent company. You have a luxury apartment in Soho waiting for you, paid for by my trust. You have a life of influence and ease ahead of you. But all of that is a lease. And I can terminate that lease in the next 5 minutes." He turned his gaze to me, his eyes flicking over my suit with utter disdain. "Your brother is a janitor with a fancy title. He is a ghost from a past you need to bury if you want to be an Ashford. You can choose him and go back to the gutter, or you can choose us and become a king. What's it going to be?" I stepped forward then, moving through the crowd that had gathered like vultures around a car crash. I put my hand on Caleb's shoulder. I could feel the tremors running through him. I looked at Richard Ashford. I didn't see a powerful man. I saw a man who was terrified of anything he couldn't buy. I didn't raise my voice. I kept it low, clinical, and sharp. "Richard," I said, the name tasting like ash. "You've spent your whole life thinking that pride is something you can buy or sell. You think power comes from a checkbook. But you just committed the ultimate sin of a businessman. You undervalued your opponent. You just made the most expensive mistake of your life. And I'm going to make sure you pay for it with every cent of your reputation." Richard laughed, a harsh, dry sound. "Get out of my club, before I have security throw you out like the trash you are." I didn't wait for a second invitation. I looked at Caleb. "Let's go." As we walked out, Alara didn't hesitate. She grabbed Caleb's hand, her veil trailing on the floor, and walked out with us, leaving her father standing in the middle of his empire, holding a glass of champagne that suddenly looked very, very empty. The drive back to my apartment was a study in absolute silence. Caleb sat in the passenger seat of my 10-year-old sedan, staring out the window at the blurred lights of the New York skyline. Alara was in the back, her massive wedding dress taking up the entire seat, her head resting against the glass. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was the kind of silence that exists in the eye of a hurricane, right before the wind tears the roof off the house. I gripped the steering wheel, my mind already spinning. Richard Ashford wasn't just a bully. He was a systemic problem. He had already threatened Caleb's career. By the time we hit the George Washington Bridge, I saw Caleb's phone light up. He looked at the screen, then tossed it onto the dashboard with a bitter laugh. "It's gone," he said. "The offer from Harrington and Vale. Withdrawn. Due to a change in corporate direction." He didn't even wait for us to get home. I didn't say anything. I knew Richard would move fast. Men like him rely on speed and trauma to force people into submission. He wanted Caleb to feel the coldness of poverty immediately so he would crawl back and beg for forgiveness. He wanted Alara to see what life was like without her father's credit cards. "I'm sorry, Ethan," Alara whispered from the back seat. I knew he was arrogant. I knew he was controlling. But I didn't think he was capable of being that small. "It's not your fault, Alara," I said. my voice sounding distant even to myself. He's not small. He's just a predator. And predators only respect one thing: a bigger predator. Or, in this case, someone who knows how to take away their food source. I thought back to the nights I had spent in buildings just like the one Richard owned. I remembered the rhythm of the mop hitting the floor. Swish, thud. Swish, thud. People think manual labor is mindless, but it's the opposite. When you're don di pivan fong qua and hung nuoi jiao ko, ben thay moi Thursday. Ban thay and hung tai lu by bo quain tren mai in. Ban thay and hung ghi chudon tren mon hin mai tin. Ban thay and hung gi hovut veo thung rac. I had spent 4 years as a janitor, but I was also an auditor in training. I had learned how to read a room, and I had learned how to read a person's secrets by the mess they left behind. Richard Ashford thought he had insulted me by calling me a janitor, but that job was my education. It taught me that no matter how high a building is, it's still held up by a foundation, and foundations can be cracked. We arrived at my apartment. It was a 2-bedroom in a pre-war building. It was clean, functional, and paid for by my own hard work. It didn't have a doorman or a view of the park, but the locks worked, and Richard Ashford didn't have the keys. "What do we do now?" Caleb asked as we walked through the door. He looked lost. He had gone from $1 million wedding to a cramped living room in the span of 2 hours. "He's going to blackball me, Ethan. I'll never work in this city again. And Alara? She has nothing now." I walked over to my desk and opened my laptop. The screen glowed, a pale blue light reflecting in my glasses. I felt a cold, familiar calm settle over me. This was my world. Not ballrooms and champagne, but data and discrepancies. "He thinks he's a lion because he has a big bank account," I said, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. "But a bank account is just a number, and numbers can be audited. He wants to play a game of power? Fine. But he's playing with someone who knows where every single cent of his money is buried. Caleb, Alara, get some sleep. Tomorrow we're not just going to fight him. We're going to audit him out of existence." I didn't sleep that night. I haven't really slept soundly since I was 21 years old. That was the year the world decided to test my structural integrity. My parents were returning from a weekend trip when a drunk driver in a pickup truck decided that a red light was merely a suggestion. In an instant, I wasn't a college student anymore. I was a legal guardian, a head of household, and a man who had to figure out how to explain to a 6-year-old why mom and dad weren't coming home. The funeral took every cent of their modest savings. The life insurance was a joke, a policy my father had bought decades ago that barely covered the cost of the casket. I remember sitting at this very same kitchen table, looking at a stack of bills and a crying child. I had a choice: stay in my prestigious accounting program and let Caleb go into the foster system, or drop out and work. I dropped out. I walked into the offices of a commercial cleaning company the next morning. I didn't ask about the pay. I just asked how many hours I could get. For the next 4 years, my life was defined by the smell of ammonia and the hum of a floor buffer. I became a ghost in the city. I worked from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., scrubbing the toilets of the very men I had hoped to work alongside. I remembered one night in particular. I was don dp van fong qua mot song tai dao tu lan tren fo wall. Tua dang lao bon lam vi qua mot doi tak cap chow ti thay mot, tap tai lu ve mot vu sap nap engwak. Tua da dung du, ke lao na trong te, vadak ton bo tep du. Tuan ra rang ho dang che jiao koan no hong tru du la thong qua mot lo hong thu don john. Luke du, tuan ra. And hung nuoi nai kong thong min han tua. Ho chi ko and hung bo vest divihan va kong ko vet chai san tren te. I didn't stop learning. I bought used textbooks for $5 at a library sale. I kept them on my cleaning cart. Between waxing floors and emptying trash cans, I would study for the CPA exam. I would do practice problems on the back of discarded envelopes. My office was a supply closet that smelled like lemon-scented bleach. I pushed myself until my eyes burned and my back felt like it was made of broken glass. I did it all so Caleb would never have to know what it felt like to be invisible. I told him I was doing overnight consulting. I made sure he had the best sneakers for basketball, the newest iPhone, and a tutor for his SATs. I wanted him to walk into a room like the Ashfords, with the absolute confidence of someone who belonged there. I succeeded. Maybe I succeeded too well. I had built a prince, but I had remained a soldier. Now, sitting in the dark of my apartment, those memories didn't feel like a burden. They felt like armor. Richard Ashford thought he could humiliate me by calling me a janitor. He didn't realize that being a janitor had given me the one thing he would never have, the ability to see through the polish to the filth underneath. I opened a secure browser and logged into a database I had spent years building. A map of the interconnected web of shell companies and offshore accounts used by the city's elite. I had started it as a hobby, a way to keep my mind sharp while I was scrubbing floors. Now it was a weapon. I typed in Ashford Group and watched as the screen filled with a complex, glowing lattice of financial structures. "Let's see what you're hiding in the trash, Richard," I whispered. My fingers flew across the keys. Swish, thud, swish, thud. The rhythm of the mop was now the rhythm of the code. I wasn't just an auditor anymore. I was a forensic hunter, and I had just picked up a scent that smelled like a multi-million-dollar tax fraud. Around 4 a.m., the door to the spare bedroom creaked open. Caleb walked out, still wearing his tuxedo trousers but with his shirt unbuttoned and hanging loose. He looked exhausted, the skin under his eyes dark and bruised. He sat down across from me, the same place he used to sit when I would help him with his math homework. "Ethan, you need to stop," he said softly. "You can't fight him. He's too big. He's got lawyers on retainer that cost more than this whole building. Maybe I should just go back. Maybe I can apologize. If I tell him I'll distance myself from you, maybe he'll let the wedding happen. Maybe he'll give me the job back." I stopped typing. I looked at my brother, the boy I had sacrificed everything for, the boy I had protected from the harsh reality of the world. And for the first time, I felt a flash of cold, sharp disappointment. "Distance yourself from me?" I asked, my voice flat. "Is that what you think this is about, Caleb? You think this is about my feelings being hurt because of a card?" "No, but..." "He didn't just insult me, Caleb. He tested us. He wanted to see if your loyalty could be bought for a 401k and a Soho loft. And you're sitting here 4 hours later considering the price. Do you realize that if you go back, you're not his son-in-law? You're his property. He will own your career, your marriage, and your children. Is that the life I worked 18-hour days for?" Caleb looked down at his hands. "I just don't want us to lose everything, Ethan. I don't want you to lose your career because of me." "I'm not going to lose anything," I said, turning the laptop screen toward him. "Look at this. This is the Ashford Group's latest quarterly filing. And this is a public record of a construction project they finished last year in Jersey City. Do you see the discrepancy?" Caleb squinted at the screen. "I don't know what I'm looking at. They reported $30 million in capital expenditures for that project. But the building permits and the subcontractor liens only total $22 million. There's $8 million missing, Caleb. $8 million that Richard Ashford moved into an offshore account in the Cayman Islands to avoid federal capital gains tax. That's not a joke. That's a felony." Caleb's eyes widened. "You found this in 4 hours?" "I found it because I knew where to look. Richard is arrogant. Arrogant people think they're too smart to get caught, so they get lazy. They leave their trash out for the janitor to find." At that moment, Alara walked into the kitchen. She had changed into one of Caleb's old, oversized hoodies, her expensive wedding hair now a tangled mess. She held her phone out to us. "My cousin just sent me this," she said, her voice trembling. It was a voice memo. She pressed play. Richard's voice filled the room, sounding relaxed and cruel. "The brother is a martyr, Patricia. People like that turn their struggle into a weapon. They think because they worked hard, we owe them a seat at the table. We don't. We owe them a paycheck and a thank you at the door. If Caleb wants to be part of this family, he needs to learn that loyalty isn't to his past. It's to the hand that feeds him. I'll break him by Tuesday. He'll be back here begging for that Soho key, and we'll make sure he never speaks to that janitor again. The recording ended. The silence in the kitchen was heavy. Caleb looked like he had been struck by lightning. The last bit of the good son. The boy who wanted everyone to get along. The boy who hoped for a peaceful life. Died right there on my kitchen floor. He looked up at me, and for the first time I didn't see a boy. I saw a man who was ready to burn the bridge he had been trying to cross. "What do we do first?" Caleb asked. I smiled. It wasn't a nice smile. "First, we give him a chance to be a human being. And when he fails that test, and we dismantle him piece by piece." The rest of the night was a blur of tactical planning. We weren't just angry, we were focused. I spent the next few hours explaining to Alara and Caleb how the Ashford Empire actually worked. Most people think billionaires are like fortresses, but they're actually more like house of cards. They rely on leverage, not just financial leverage, but the leverage of reputation. Richard Ashford spent millions every year on philanthropy. He sat on the boards of museums and hospitals. He wanted to be seen as a pillar of the community. Why? Because when you're a pillar, no one looks at what's buried underneath you. They're too busy admiring the view. "He's in the middle of a merger," Alara noted, pointing at a news article on my second monitor. "Ashford Group is trying to acquire Harrington and Vale's commercial division. It's a $40 million deal." "Exactly," I said. "And Harrington and Vale is a publicly traded company. They have a fiduciary duty to their shareholders. If their new partner is under federal investigation for tax evasion, the deal dies. And if the deal dies, Richard's stock price plunges. He's over-leveraged. He's using the merger to cover the $8 million hole I found." I started drafting an email. It wasn't to Richard. It was to a contact I had at the IRS, a man named Miller who I had helped on a massive corporate fraud case 2 years ago. Miller was the kind of guy who lived for the big fish. "Are you sure about this, Ethan?" Caleb asked. "Once you send that, there's no turning back. He'll come after you with everything he has." "He already did," I said, my finger hovering over the send key. "He tried to take your career. He tried to humiliate our family. He's already fired his best shot. Now it's my turn. And I don't miss." I hit send. The room felt lighter after that. We spent the next hour gathering more evidence. Alara provided us with her father's private calendar and the names of his fixers, the lawyers and consultants who handled the dirty work. She was done being a princess. She was proving she was a Bennett now. "I need you to call him, Alara," I said as the sun began to peek over the horizon. "Tell him you want a family meeting. Tell him you're confused and upset, and that you want to talk about the future. Tell him we'll come to the house on Saturday. He'll think he's won," she said. "That's the point. An arrogant man is never more vulnerable than when he thinks he's already won. We want him relaxed. We want him talking. And most importantly, we want him in a room where he thinks he's the one in control." I looked at my brother and Alara. They were exhausted, but they were standing tall. Richard Ashford thought he was fighting a janitor brother and a sentimental daughter. He didn't realize he was fighting a team that had nothing left to lose and the technical skills to take everything he had. "Go get some sleep," I told them. "The audit has officially begun." I stayed up as they went to bed. I watched the sunrise over the city, the same sun I used to see as I walked home with my mop and bucket. For 15 years, I had been building a life for my brother. Now, for the first time, I was building a reckoning. And it was going to be beautiful. Saturday was 4 days away. In the world of forensic auditing, 4 days is an eternity if you know how to navigate the digital back alleys of corporate finance. While Caleb and Alara tried to maintain a facade of normalcy, Caleb dealing with the fallout of his lost job, and Alara ignoring the dozens of frantic texts from her mother, I went to work. I didn't go to my office. I took a personal week and stayed in my apartment. surrounded by 3 monitors and enough caffeine to power a small village. Hunting a man like Richard Ashford isn't about looking for one big mistake. It's about finding the pattern of 1,000 small ones. Narcissists always leave a trail. They can't help it. They think they're so much smarter than the system that they start to treat the law as a set of suggestions for lesser people. I started with the Ashford Foundation. On paper, it was a beautiful thing. It provided scholarships for underprivileged kids and funded urban renewal projects. But when I cross-referenced the foundation's payouts with the construction companies Richard used for his commercial projects, an ugly picture began to emerge. Richard wasn't just giving money away. He was donating to the foundation, taking the massive tax write-off, and then the foundation was hiring contractors that Richard secretly owned or controlled. It was a circular flow of cash, a sophisticated money laundering scheme designed to turn tax-deductible donations back into private profit. I spent 6 hours on Thursday just tracing a single line of $2 million. It started in a community park fund in the Bronx and ended up in a holding company in the British Virgin Islands that paid for the interior design of Richard's private jet. Swish, thud. I whispered to myself as I dragged another spreadsheet into my analysis folder. People think auditors are boring. They think we're just bean counters. But what we really are is historians of greed. We look at the debris left behind by people's desires and we reconstruct the crime. Richard Ashford thought he was a visionary. I saw him for what he really was. A man who was stealing from the very children his foundation claimed to help. By Friday morning, I had enough. I didn't just have the $8 million tax gap. I had evidence of systematic wire fraud, racketeering, and charity embezzlement. I had a paper trail that was 10 miles long and made of pure, unadulterated felony. I received a text from Miller at the IRS. It was short and professional. Documents received. Preliminary review complete. This is significant, Ethan. We're spinning up a task force. Stay in touch. I felt a cold shiver of satisfaction. The wheels of the federal government are slow, but once they start grinding, they don't stop until there's nothing left but dust. Richard Ashford was currently planning a victory meeting for Saturday, thinking he was going to buy my silence for a few $100,000. He had no idea that the IRS was already preparing his room in a much less luxurious country club. Dui de la fan tip theo va kung la fan hon tien qua ton bo siu kichban. Noi tip 2 part 3.1 de dua ka chuyen den emotit sai ket chuan zak. De tin fan zet bang chung siu fap ly va thoa man tep kunjia my lan tuoi. By Friday evening, the atmosphere inside my apartment felt like a war room right before a major offensive. I didn't turn on the lights. The only illumination came from the sharp blue glow of my monitors, casting long, geometric shadows against the walls. Caleb was sitting on the floor, his back against the couch, checking his phone every few minutes. Alara was staring at a printed organizational chart of her father's holding companies, her finger tracing the lines between the shell corporations I had uncovered. Ethan, she said, her voice dropping into a quiet, serious register. If you hit him here at the core of the hotel rebrand project, what happens to the employees? The people working at the properties? I didn't stop typing. The properties will survive, Alara. They are hard assets. They have real value. It's the management structure above them, the corporate parasite feeding off their revenue, that will be cut away. Your father isn't building hotels. He's building debt traps and calling them luxury assets. Look at the Harrington and Vail merger papers. I pulled up a document on the center screen. It was a copy of the preliminary merger agreement that Alara had pulled from her personal cloud storage. Documents her father had left on the kitchen counter weeks ago when he was boasting about his financial genius. To an untrained eye, the contract looked pristine. It promised a mutual share swap and a joint venture that would dominate the eastern seaboard. But as a forensic auditor, I don't read what's on the page. I look for what's missing between the lines. Here, I pointed to a clause in Section 14, subsection B. The Ashford Group guarantees that all outstanding liabilities for the Jersey City development have been amortized through their charitable foundation. That's why he used the word charity as an insult to me at the wedding. He's been using his foundation as a garbage bin for his bad debts. He takes a loss, dumps it into the nonprofit entity, claims a federal tax credit, and then tells Harrington and Vale that his balance sheet is clean. And if Harrington and Vale find out before the closing on Monday? Caleb asked, standing up and looking over my shoulder. They won't just pull the offer, I said, a cold grin touching my lips. They will sue him for breach of contract and fraud. They have a non-disclosure and good faith agreement signed by Richard himself. If they find out that he's hiding an $8 million federal tax liability under the guise of philanthropic giving, their legal team will tear him apart before the federal government even gets a chance to indict him. I picked up my phone and called a number I had memorized during my time working corporate compliance cases. It belonged to the chief legal counsel at Harrington and Vale, a woman named Arthur who was famous for her total lack of sentimentality. She didn't know me personally, but she knew my firm, and she knew my reputation for finding things people wanted to stay buried. Ms. Arthur, I said when the line connected. My name is Ethan Bennett. I'm a senior forensic auditor. I believe you currently have an employment file on my brother, Caleb Bennett, which was flagged for termination yesterday morning on the advice of Richard Ashford. There was a long pause on the other end of the line, the sound of paper shifting. Mr. Bennett, I don't usually take calls regarding entry-level personnel matters from outside auditors. You do when that entry-level employee's brother is currently holding the forensic audit trail for the Ashford Group's Jersey City project, I said, keeping my tone perfectly flat, devoid of emotion. The project your firm is about to acquire on Monday morning. I'm sending you an encrypted PDF right now. I suggest you open it before you sign the closing documents. It contains 80 pages of circular cash flows that your due diligence team somehow missed. I hit the send button on my laptop. The progress bar loaded in less than 3 seconds. I'll call you back in 10 minutes, Mr. Bennett, she said. The line went dead. I set the phone down on the desk. The trap was set, the steel jaws were open, and all we had to do now was walk into the lion's den on Saturday morning and let Richard Ashford talk himself into a corner. Saturday morning arrived with a gray, unforgiving fog that rolled off the Hudson River and settled over the old money estates of Westchester County. We drove in Caleb's old sedan, the engine making a rhythmic, ticking noise that felt entirely out of place among the fleets of black Range Rovers and polished Mercedes passing us on the highway. Alara had dressed in a simple black wool coat, her hair pulled back into a tight ponytail. She looked less like a billionaire's daughter and more like a prosecutor heading into court. As we neared the Ashford estate, the wrought iron gates swung open automatically. The security guards at the booth didn't ask for identification. Richard had obviously told them to expect us. He wanted us inside. He wanted this done on his turf, where the sheer scale of his wealth could act as a psychological weight to crush any lingering resistance we had. The house, known as the Ashford House, was a massive stone structure that looked less like a home and more like an insurance company headquarters built in the 1920s. It was designed to intimidate. The limestone pillars were too thick, the windows were too narrow and dark, and the gravel driveway crunched under our tires like breaking bones. Remember, I said as I pulled the key out of the ignition, the car shuddering to a halt. No shouting, no emotional outbursts. If he insults me, you let him. If he calls us trash, you smile. A narcissist cannot function when his target refuses to react to his provocations. He needs your anger to justify his own cruelty. If you give him nothing but silence and logic, he will overreach. He will try to fill the silence with his own voice, and that's where he'll give us the final pieces we need. Caleb nodded, his face pale but completely steady. He reached over and took Alara's hand. I'm good, Ethan. I'm done being afraid of him. We got out of the car. The front door was opened by an assistant who didn't look us in the eye. We were led through a cavernous foyer filled with oil paintings of landscapes Richard had probably bought at auction just to fill the wall space. We were shown into the formal sitting room, a space that smelled of leather, expensive wood smoke, and old paper. Richard Ashford was sitting in a high-backed leather wing chair by the fireplace. He didn't stand up when we entered. To his right sat his wife, Patricia, looking stiff and miserable, her fingers nervously twisting her diamond wedding ring. To his left sat a man in a perfectly tailored gray suit with a leather briefcase open on his knees, Vance, the Ashford Group's chief asset protection attorney. "Well," Richard said, not looking up from a tablet he was holding, "the prodigal daughter returns. And she brought the help with her. Let's be efficient about this. I have a tea time at 1 o'clock, and I don't want to spend my morning dealing with the consequences of your bad taste. Alara." I walked into the center of the room, choosing not to sit on the silk-upholstered sofa opposite him. I stood, my hands clasped behind my back, using the exact posture I use when I'm delivering a hostile audit report to a board of directors. "We're here because your daughter asked for one private conversation before this situation becomes a matter of public record. Richard," I said, my voice cutting through the warmth of the fireplace like a scalpel. Richard finally looked up, his thin lips curling into that familiar, arrogant smirk. "Public record? You really are delusional, aren't you, Ethan? You think because you have a little certificate and a desk job at a mid-tier firm, you have leverage in this room? You're a mouse trying to threaten an elephant. Sit down before you embarrass your brother any further." The silence in the room after Richard spoke was heavy, but it wasn't the kind of silence he expected. He expected Caleb to apologize. He expected Alara to cry. Instead, we just stood there, watching him with a cold, clinical curiosity that seemed to make his attorney, Vance, slightly uncomfortable. Vance shifted his weight in his chair, his eyes flicking between me and the briefcase on his lap. "Richard," Vance said quietly, leaning forward, "let's just present the agreement." Richard waved his hand dismissively. "No, Vance. Let them understand where they stand first. I want it clear that I am doing this out of a sense of charity, the same charity your brother seems to think he's too good for. Caleb, you've lost your position at Harrington and Vale. That was step 1. By Monday morning, I can ensure that your name is associated with a security breach at the country club. I can make sure no engineering firm within 500 miles of Manhattan will touch your resume. You will be back to Don DP Navi Sin with your brother by the end of the month." He turned his gaze to me, his eyes narrowing. "And you, I've looked into your little mobile skills van project. The one you spend your weekends on trying to teach poor kids how to write resumes so they can pretend to be professional. The foundation that funds that van, the main donor is a close personal friend of mine. One call from me, and your little charity project is dead in the water. The van gets repossessed. The kids go back to the street. You want to talk about expensive mistakes, Ethan? You're looking at the man who can turn your entire life into ash with a single text message." I looked at him, and inside my head, the numbers were clicking into place. He was exposing his flanks. He was telling me exactly what he loved. His ability to destroy things from a distance using other people's hands. He thought that was power. "You think loyalty is something you can manufacture through scarcity, Richard?" I said, my voice dropping an octave, becoming perfectly smooth. "You think that if you take away a man's bread, he will kiss your shoes for the crumbs. It's a classic corporate management philosophy from the 1980s, but it has one fundamental flaw. It assumes the person you're starving doesn't know how to cook." Richard slammed his tablet down on the mahogany table between us. The sharp clack echoed through the high-ceilinged room. "I don't need a lecture on management from a man who smells like industrial floor cleaner. Vance, give them the terms." Vance pulled a thick document from his briefcase and slid it across the table. "This is a structured separation and non-disclosure agreement," Vance said, his voice professional, devoid of his boss's malice. "Under these terms, Ethan Bennett will receive a lump sum payment of $500,000, tax-free, administered through an offshore corporate structure. In exchange, he will sign a permanent non-disclosure agreement regarding the Ashford family and will legally agree to have no contact, direct or indirect, with Caleb and Alara Bennett for a period of 10 years. Caleb, your position at Harrington and Vale will be restored with a 20% signing bonus, and the Soho apartment lease will be transferred into your name permanently. You have 20 minutes to sign." Richard leaned back, a look of complete, absolute victory on his face. He thought he had found our price. He thought $500,000 was enough to buy a brother's soul and a sister's silence. He thought every person in the world had a budget, and he had just met ours. I looked down at the document. I didn't touch it. I looked at Caleb, who was staring at Richard with an expression that looked very much like pity. $500,000, I said softly, as if I were evaluating the cost of an office chair. Through an offshore structure. Let me guess, Richard. The funds are coming from the Jersey City Development account, filtered through the Ashford Foundation's Urban Renewal Grant Program. Right? The room went dead silent. The fire popped behind us. A sharp, orange spark hitting the screen, but nobody blinked. For the first time that morning, Richard Ashford's smile didn't look quite so stable. Richard's attorney, Vance, froze. His hand, which had been reaching for his gold Mont Blanc pen, stopped mid-air. He looked at me, then slowly turned his head to look at his client. A forensic auditor knows the exact physical signs of corporate panic. The slight tightening of the vocal cords, the way a person stops breathing for a fraction of a second, the subtle shift in posture as the brain realizes it has just walked into an ambush. "What did you just say?" Richard asked, his voice losing its booming, theatrical quality, dropping into something sharp and dangerous. "I asked if the $500,000 you're offering to buy my silence is coming from the same $8 million pool you skimmed from the Jersey City hotel project last year," I said. I stepped forward, reached into my coat pocket, and pulled out 3 identical bound folders. I didn't throw them. I placed them gently on the table, right on top of his non-disclosure agreement. "Vance, you should open the first folder," I said, looking directly at the attorney. "Page 12. It contains the bank routing numbers for a shell company registered in Grand Cayman called Alpha Properties Limited. You'll find that the sole authorized signer for that account isn't Richard Ashford. It's his administrative assistant, acting under a power of attorney signed 3 days before the wedding planner submitted my sardonically written name card to the caterers." Vance didn't open the folder immediately. He didn't need to. He was a corporate lawyer. He knew exactly what those words meant. He knew that if I had the routing numbers, I had the wire transfer confirmations. "Richard," Vance whispered, his face turning an ash-gray color that matched his suit. "Did you authorize an offshore transfer from the foundation accounts this week?" "Shut up, Vance," Richard snapped, his face turning a dark, mottled red. He stood up from his leather chair, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. "He's bluffing. He's a public servant with a title he bought online. He doesn't have access to those records. Those are private corporate files." "They were private," I said, my voice remaining entirely calm, a stark contrast to his rising rage. "Until you checked the box on your federal tax return claiming that the Ashford Foundation had 0 international transactions. The moment you lied on a federal disclosure document, Richard, those files stopped being private. They became evidence of wire fraud and grand larceny under Title 18 of the United States Code." Caleb walked up next to me, his arms crossed over his chest. He looked at his future father-in-law, his voice carrying the weight of 15 years of watching me work. "He doesn't bluff, Richard. When my brother tells you your numbers don't match, you should start looking for a lawyer who specializes in federal prison consulting, not asset protection." "You ungrateful little bastard," Richard shouted, stepping around the table, his finger pointed directly at Caleb's face. "I gave you everything. I built a path for you. You were nobody until my daughter dragged you into my house. I pay for the clothes on your back right now." "Actually, Dad," Alara said, her voice quiet but piercing through his shouts like ice. "Ethan paid for Caleb's suit. He paid for my dress, too, after I called the bridal shop and canceled your credit card authorization yesterday morning. We don't want your money, Dad. We don't want your apartment. We don't want anything that has your name attached to it, because everything you touch belongs to the federal government anyway." Richard looked at his daughter, his eyes wide with a mixture of fury and disbelief. "You're throwing away your inheritance for these people? For a family of janitors? You will starve out there, Alara." I will personally see to it that you don't receive a single cent from the family trust. The trust is already frozen, Richard, I said, tapping the folder on the table. As of 6:30 this morning, the Eastern District of New York's Criminal Division issued a temporary asset preservation order based on a whistleblower filing submitted by my office. You aren't cutting her out of anything. You don't have anything left to give. The room went completely quiet again, but this time the silence was absolute. Richard Ashford looked like a man who had just stepped out of an airplane without a parachute. His breath was coming in short, ragged gasps, his chest heaving under his custom-made shirt. He looked at Vance, but Vance was already closing his leather briefcase, his eyes fixed firmly on the floor. Then the transformation began. I had seen it 100 times in audit interviews with corrupt executives. When power fails, the narcissist turns to trauma. They turn to Darvo, deny, attack, reverse victim, and offender. Richard sank back into his leather wing chair, his shoulders slumping. He placed his hands over his face, letting out a long, shuddering sigh that sounded remarkably like a sob. When he pulled his hands away, his eyes were wide and filled with tears that looked entirely real if you didn't know the budget behind them. Patricia, he groaned, reaching out a hand toward his wife, who looked terrified. Do you see what they're doing to me? In my own home? After 30 years of building a business to protect this family, after working myself to the bone so my daughter could have everything, they come into my house with fabricated documents to destroy my name. He looked up at Alara, his voice cracking with an artificial, practiced sorrow. Alara, sweetheart, how can you let him do this to your father? You know me. You know I'm not a criminal. Everything I did for you. The Jersey City project. It was an investment for your future children. Yes, maybe we used some aggressive tax strategies. Every major corporation does it. It's how the business world functions. I was trying to protect our legacy from a government that wants to tax us into oblivion. And you're letting this outsider, this bitter, angry man who hates us because of our success, ruin our lives over a joke at a dinner table. He turned his tear-filled eyes toward me, his voice hardening just enough to show the malice beneath the grief. You've planned this, haven't you, Ethan? You've been waiting for a chance to attack me. You're jealous. You're a bitter man who spent his youth with a mop bucket while men like me built the world. And now you want to use your little government badge to drag me down into the mud with you. You're using my daughter as a weapon because you couldn't build a life of your own. Patricia Ashford finally spoke, her voice high and tight with panic. Alara, please, talk to your brother. Tell him to stop this. Your father's heart, his blood pressure, he can't handle this kind of stress. We can settle this. We can give Ethan more money. Whatever he wants. Just don't let them take our home. I watched them. I didn't feel anger. I didn't feel pity. I felt the same cold, detached professional satisfaction I feel when a mathematical equation finally balances out to zero. It's a good performance, Richard, I said, reaching into my coat pocket once more and pulling out my phone. I laid it on the table next to the folders. But you're missing one crucial element. Your audience has already seen the rehearsal. I pressed the screen. The speaker didn't play music. It played the voice memo Alara had shown me in my kitchen, the recording of Richard laughing with his assistant about teaching Caleb scarcity, and making sure the janitor brother was reminded of his place before he got too comfortable. The recorded voice was loud, clear, and utterly devoid of the tearful sorrow Richard had just spent the last 2 minutes manufacturing. It was the voice of a tyrant enjoying his own cruelty. Richard's face went instantly flat. The tears stopped. The trembling hand dropped to his side. The performance was over because the audience had just pulled back the curtain. That recording was taken in a private office, Vance said, his lawyer's brain finally finding a procedural foothold. It's inadmissible under New York state wiretapping laws. It's a two-party state for oral communication. It's a one-party state for electronic recordings if one participant consents. Vance, I replied smoothly. And the person who recorded this was your assistant, who happened to be on the phone with Alara at the time to discuss the floral arrangements. She consented to the record. Next question. Vance closed his mouth and didn't open it again. He knew the procedural fight was lost. In the world of federal financial crimes, once the paper trail is verified and the intent is established on tape, the defense options shrink down to a single word: mitigation. Richard, I said, leaning over the table, my shadow falling over his thick gold watch and his useless tablet. You thought you were dealing with a family argument. You thought you could call your friends at Harrington and Vale and have my brother removed like an inconvenient piece of furniture. But you forgot that Harrington and Vale is a compliance-driven organization. The moment Ms. Arthur saw the Jersey City tax records I sent her last night, she realized that your merger wasn't a partnership. It was a liability transfer. Right on cue, Richard's tablet began to buzz. A notification appeared on the screen. An urgent email from the executive board of Harrington and Vale. Richard reached for it with a trembling hand. He opened it, his eyes scanning the lines of text. I already knew what it said. The merger is dead, Richard. I told him, not waiting for him to finish reading. They've pulled out of the closing. They're citing a breach of the good faith representation clause. And they're currently preparing a secondary suit to recover the $3 million in earnest money they deposited into your escrow account last month. Money you've already spent to cover your payroll losses in Miami. Richard's breath hitched. He looked up at me, his eyes wide, the arrogance completely drained from his face, replaced by the naked, desperate terror of a man who realized his entire financial life was collapsing in real time. How did you get the escrow records? He whispered, his voice cracking. I didn't need a warrant for those, Richard, I said, tapping the second folder. Your escrow agent uses an outsourced accounting firm located in Queens. The senior partner there used to be my supervisor when I was an intern. He knows I don't ask for files unless there's a federal interest involved. When I showed him the circular cash flows from your foundation, he realized his own firm was about to be implicated in a multimillion-dollar money laundering scheme. He didn't give me the files. He handed them directly to the IRS Criminal Investigation Division at 7:15 this morning. You destroyed me, Richard said, his voice dropping into a flat, monotone whisper. In 48 hours. You destroyed everything I spent 30 years building. No, Richard, I said, straightening up and looking down at him. You destroyed yourself. You built a house out of stolen bricks, and then you had the audacity to invite the public to admire the architecture. I didn't destroy anything. I just did what a janitor always does. I came into your room, I looked at the trash you left in the corner, and I put it where it belongs. Caleb stepped forward, looking at the man who had tried to own him. My brother didn't use a weapon, Richard. He used your own signature. He used your own bank statements. You spent your whole life thinking that people like us are disposable because we don't have your title. But the truth is, you're the one who's disposable, because your entire existence is built on a lie that can be erased by a single audit. Alara walked to the door, not looking back at her parents or the luxury room she had grown up in. Let's go, Ethan. The air in here is starting to smell like a liquidation sale. As we walked out of the sitting room, we could hear Patricia Ashford starting to scream at her husband, her voice sharp and frantic, asking where the offshore money was hidden. Richard didn't answer her. He just sat there, staring at the 3 folders on his mahogany table, looking like an old man who had finally run out of other people's money to spend. We didn't wait for the security guards to open the gates on our way out. The moment we reached the gravel driveway, 2 black Chevy Suburbans with federal government plates pulled through the entrance, their tires throwing up small showers of stones as they sped toward the main house. I didn't stop the car. I just pulled over to the side of the narrow road to let them pass. Through the tinted glass of the passenger window, I saw the profile of Special Agent Miller sitting in the front seat, a thick leather folder on his lap. He didn't look at me and I didn't wave. We didn't need to exchange greetings. The data had done the talking for us. As the feds parked in front of the limestone pillars of Ashford House, Caleb turned around in his seat to look at Alara. She was staring out the window, watching the agents walk up the stone steps with their raid jackets on. Her face was completely still, her eyes reflecting the gray light of the afternoon sky. "Are you okay?" Caleb asked, his voice soft, filled with a protective tenderness that made me proud to be his brother. She took a deep breath, her shoulders rising and falling under her wool coat. "I'm not happy, Caleb. It's a horrible thing to watch your father turn out to be a thief. But I'm relieved. For 24 years, I've been told that my value was tied to that house and that name. I've been told that if I ever left, I'd be nothing. But standing in that room today, watching Ethan dismantle him with nothing but a few pieces of paper, I realized that my father wasn't powerful at all. He was just loud. Gwyn Luke Tuk Su La and Hung Gi Ethan Ko. Kanong Dung Vung Trong Bao Tap V on I beat Min Dang Noi Su that. She looked at me in the rearview mirror. "Thank you, Ethan, for showing me the difference." "Don't thank me yet, Alara," I said, pulling the sedan back onto the main road. "The next 6 months are going to be a mess. The press is going to get hold of the indictment by Monday afternoon. Your name is going to be in the papers. People you thought were your friends are going to stop calling you because they're afraid their own family finances will get audited if they stand too close to you." "Good," she said, a small, sharp smile appearing on her face. "Let them stay away. It saves me the trouble of having to figure out who's real and who's just looking for an invitation to the next country club dinner." We drove back to the city in silence, but it was a different kind of silence than the one we had shared on Thursday night. This was the quiet satisfaction of a project completed, a ledger balanced, a structural defect repaired. When we got back to my apartment, I didn't go to the kitchen to celebrate or pop open a bottle of cheap wine. I went straight to my desk, opened my laptop, and logged into my firm's secure network. I had an internal audit report due for a manufacturing company in Ohio on Monday morning, and the numbers didn't care about my family drama. They needed to be checked. As my fingers began to hit the keys again, the familiar rhythm filled the small room. Swish, thud, swish, thud. Caleb and Alara sat on the couch together, looking through an apartment rental app, talking about locations in Queens and Brooklyn where the rent was cheap and the doorman didn't exist. They were starting from zero, but they were starting together, and they were starting with their heads held high. Richard Ashford thought he had taken away their future when he took away their luxury leases. He didn't realize that the only thing he had actually given them was their freedom. The federal grand jury indictment was handed down on Tuesday morning, right on schedule. The headline on the front page of the Wall Street Journal's real estate section didn't mention the wedding or the name card, of course. It simply read, "Ashford Group Chairman indicted on multimillion-dollar wire fraud and tax evasion charges." The fallout was immediate and catastrophic, the way corporate collapses always are when the foundation is made of debt and lies. By Wednesday afternoon, the Ashford Group stock price had plummeted 60% as institutional investors scrambled to liquidate their positions before the federal government could freeze the trading accounts. The $40 million merger with Harrington and Vail didn't just die. It became a radioactive asset that no investment bank in New York would touch. I stood in the break room of my firm, holding a mug of black coffee, watching the cable news coverage of Richard Ashford leaving the federal courthouse in Lower Manhattan. He looked different without his tailored tuxedo and his custom lighting. He looked smaller, his silver hair messy from the wind, his hands covered by his coat sleeves to hide the handcuffs underneath. He was flanked by 2 defense lawyers who looked like they were already calculated their hourly fees against whatever liquid assets he had left. The museum board he sat on removed his name from their donor wall by Thursday night. The hospital foundation he chaired issued a polished, 2-sentence press release stating that Richard Ashford had stepped down to focus on personal matters. The careful, polite language of the ultra-wealthy was put to work, erasing him from their circle with the same cold efficiency he had used against me at the wedding table. Alara's mother, Patricia, moved out of the Westchester estate a week later. She didn't leave out of a sudden burst of moral clarity. She left because the bank had filed a foreclosure notice on the property after Richard's commercial accounts were frozen by the IRS. She called Alara once from a hotel in Miami, crying and asking if Caleb could talk to me about getting some of the asset freezes lifted. Alara handled the call with the same calm, unyielding logic we had established in my kitchen. "Mom," she said, her voice steady as she washed a coffee mug in my sink. "Ethan doesn't freeze accounts. The United States Department of Justice does. If Dad didn't want his money frozen, he shouldn't have put it in a bucket labeled fraud. I can't help you, and Ethan certainly won't." She hung up the phone and went back to her work. She had taken a job as an assistant manager at a local bookstore in Brooklyn, earning $15 an hour. Her hands, which had never done anything harder than hold a champagne glass, were starting to develop small calluses from carrying boxes of books. She wore them like jewelry. Caleb had found a position at a mid-sized civil engineering firm in Long Island City. It wasn't as prestigious as Harrington and Vale, and the starting salary was 30% lower, but the owner was an old-school engineer who had started his career as a surveyor's assistant. When he heard why Caleb had left his previous offer, he shook his hand and said, "I don't care who your father-in-law is, kid. I care about your structural calculations. Welcome to the team." They moved into a small, one-bedroom apartment 3 blocks from mine. The floors were uneven. The radiator hissed like an angry cat every morning at 5, and the view from the window was a brick wall and a fire escape. But it was their brick wall, paid for by their checks, and there wasn't a single person in the world who could tell them they didn't belong there. With Richard Ashford's influence removed from the local corporate boards, the air in the community seemed to clear out. About a month after the indictment, I received an email from the director of the Community Development Fund, the organization that had paused my mobile skills van project on Richard's advice. The language was deeply apologetic, filled with the standard corporate explanations about administrative reviews and procedural backlogs. They weren't just restoring the grant. They were increasing it by $15,000 to cover the delay. They had realized that standing on the wrong side of a forensic audit trail was bad for public relations. I didn't send them an angry reply. I didn't remind them of how they had backed down when a billionaire snapped his fingers. I just accepted the funds, signed the contract, and spent my Saturday morning checking the brake pads and the oil level on the old Ford Econoline van that served as our mobile classroom. The skills van opened for its first official session in late August, parked in a vacant lot next to a housing project in the South Bronx. We had 2 folding tables, 10 refurbished laptops donated by my firm, and a stack of printed templates for entry-level resumes and financial literacy guides. Caleb was there every Saturday morning, his tool belt on, helping the kids understand the basics of mechanical drawing and structural logic. Alara sat at the other table, her bookstore experience coming in handy as she helped high school juniors draft their college application essays, teaching them how to tell their stories without sounding like they were begging for charity. "Look at them," Caleb said to me during a break, pointing toward a group of 16-year-olds who were arguing over a spreadsheet formula on one of the screens. "They're not trying to impress anyone, Ethan. They're just trying to figure out how the system works so they can build something real. That's the secret, Caleb," I said, leaning against the side of the van, watching the gray city sky start to clear. "The world is full of men like Richard Ashford who think they own the machine because they have the keys to the office. But the machine doesn't care about the keys. Cares about the mechanics. The people who know how the gears turn will always survive the people who just own the building." The van project grew faster than I had anticipated. By October, we had a retired math teacher volunteering 2 nights a week, and a local mechanic who offered to handle the van's maintenance for free because his nephew had used our resume guide to land an apprenticeship at an aviation logistics firm. What Richard had tried to crush because it didn't have his name on it had become an independent ecosystem, a structure held up by dozens of small, ordinary hands that his money could never touch or control. Every time I watched a kid walk out of that van holding a clean, printed copy of their first real resume, their shoulders straight, their eyes fixed on the future with a sense of practical confidence, I thought about that white cream cardstock card at the Westchester Country Club. Richard had meant it as a prison sentence, an absolute declaration of my inferiority. Instead, it had become a building permit. It had forced us to move out of the shadow of his money and build a foundation that was entirely our own. In late November, the first real snow of the season hit New York, a heavy, wet slush that turned the concrete streets into a gray muck. I came home late from a corporate audit in Midtown, my boots soaked through, my eyes burning from 8 hours of looking at inventory depreciation ledgers. As I walked up the brownstone steps to my apartment building, I noticed a figure standing under the small canvas awning near the buzzer panel. He didn't have an umbrella. He was wearing a heavy camel hair coat that looked like it had once been very expensive, but the hem was stained with dirty street water, and one of the bone buttons was missing from the cuff. He was leaning against the stone wall, his hands crammed deep into his pockets, his shoulders hunched against the cold wind. When I reached the top step, he turned his head. It was Richard Ashford. The transformation was complete. His face was thin, the skin loose under his jaw, his famous silver hair damp and matted against his forehead. The fierce, predatory energy that had filled the Platinum Ballroom in Westchester was entirely gone. He looked like an old man who had spent the day walking through a city that didn't know his name. "Ethan," he said, his voice coming out in a thin, gravelly wheeze that made him cough. "I've been waiting here for 2 hours. Your buzzer doesn't work." "The buzzer works fine, Richard," I said, keeping my hand on my briefcase, my voice clinical and flat. "It just doesn't ring for people who aren't on the lease. What do you want?" He swallowed hard, his eyes dropping to my boots before coming back up to my face. "The lawyers, Vance's firm, they dropped me last Tuesday. They said my retainer account was depleted. The federal prosecutors are offering a plea deal. 7 years, Ethan. 7 years in a medium security facility in Pennsylvania. They want me to sign it by Friday morning." That sounds like an appropriate mitigation strategy given the volume of the wire fraud evidence. "Richard," I said, not moving toward the door keyhole. 7 years means you'll probably serve 4 with good behavior. You should take it." "I can't survive in there, Ethan," he said, his voice rising, a sudden, desperate flash of his old theatrical panic breaking through the exhaustion. "I'm 62 years old. My health, my reputation, everything is gone. The house is being sold at public auction next month. Patricia won't return my calls. Alara changed her phone number. I went to her apartment in Brooklyn, but the super wouldn't let me pass the lobby. He said she had a protective order filed against my name." "She did," I said. "I helped her fill out the paperwork. Your administrative assistant's recording made it very clear that you represent a systemic threat to her financial security. The state of New York agreed with our assessment." He stepped closer to me, the scent of expensive damp wool and cheap gin rolling off his coat. "Ethan, please. You have the ear of the IRS investigators. Miller trusts you. If you tell them that the Jersey City data was an accounting error, if you tell them that we can settle the discrepancy through an amended corporate filing, I can pay a fine. I can find the money somewhere. I have friends in Chicago who owe me favors. Just tell them to drop the criminal intent clause." I looked at him, the man who had sat on his high-backed leather chair like a king, offering me $500,000 to disappear from my brother's life. I looked at his wet coat, his missing button, and the naked, desperate greed that still lived in his eyes. He still thought the world was a ledger where you could pay a fine to make your character flaws disappear. "Richard," I said, my voice dropping into that absolute, quiet certainty that comes from 15 years of Don DP Cac Dong Do Nat. "You spent your whole life thinking that money could buy silence, loyalty, and forgiveness. But it cannot buy character, cannot buy family, and it certainly cannot buy respect once you have taught the people closest to you that your love comes with a price tag. I'm not going to call Miller. I'm not going to change a single digit on that audit report. You wanted to teach my brother about consequences? Consider this your masterclass." I turned the key in the lock, stepped inside the warm hallway, and closed the heavy oak door gently behind me, letting the lock click into place with a clear, final thud. I didn't look through the glass to see if he was still standing there. I was free and my brother was free, and the ledger was finally balanced to 0. The snow continued to fall through the night, covering the city in a thick, silent blanket that muffled the sound of the traffic below. On Sunday morning, I walked down to the small coffee shop on the corner of Caleb's block. As I reached the intersection, I saw my brother and Alara coming out of the laundromat. Caleb was carrying a large plastic basket filled with folded clothes, and Alara was holding 2 paper cups of cheap deli coffee, her boots leaving deep, clear prints in the fresh snow. They weren't looking at the buildings or the luxury cars passing by. They were looking at each other, arguing with wide, bright smiles about whether they should buy a second-hand kitchen table or spend the money on a new set of tires for Caleb's sedan. They looked young, tired, and completely alive. Richard Ashford thought success was something you inherited through bloodlines and protected with non-disclosure agreements. He thought education was a collection of degrees from schools with ivy on the walls, and that dignity was something you could buy if your bank account was large enough. But he was wrong. Real education is learning how to stand up when the room is laughing at your sacrifice. Real dignity is knowing that your worth isn't measured by the table where someone chooses to seat you, but by the people who choose to leave the room with you when that table becomes toxic. My brother didn't become successful because a powerful man opened a door for him. He became successful because love kept a roof over his head until he had the strength to build his own. The deepest revenge wasn't watching the Ashford Group collapse or seeing Richard's name dragged through the federal court system. It was watching the very skills I had learned while pushing a mop bucket become a tool to protect the people I loved. It was seeing shame turn into community service, and seeing a broken family legacy turn into an honest, self-reliant life. Money can buy comfort, it can buy fear, and it can buy a room full of people who will laugh at your jokes when you're winning. But it can never buy the one thing Richard Ashford lost forever in that platinum ballroom: the respect of the people who saw through his power to the emptiness inside.